Hello, folks. Welcome to this week's episode of Catholic Recon, Testimonies from Reverts and Converts. Today, I've got Mr. Gene Fadness. Gene, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it. So, I first heard about Gene because of the men's conference, the Idaho Catholic Men's Conference. He gave his testimony, what was that, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Gene?
2 or 3 years ago, yeah.
And I was amazed by his testimony and immediately reached out and wanted to get him on the show. He's the communications director for the Diocese of Boise, as well as the editor for the Idaho Catholic Register. And in addition to that, he's a deacon at St. Mary's Parish here in Boise.
That's right.
You know, I think that, were you also on the journey home with Marcus Grodi?
I was.
I saw something like that.
It's been a while. I think it was, I want to say about 2006.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, it's been a while. I noticed my episode was episode number 222. And now when I watch it, if you look right at the very end, if you want to order it, they'll say order episode. And I think they're up into the like 800s or 900s now. So I was on way back.
Wow.
Episode 222.
Wow. Well, I think this, for you here, this is episode 12. So
All right.
we've got a long way to go. But yeah, anyway, it's a pleasure to have you here. I look forward to hearing your story. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks. And thank you for doing this. I love hearing conversion stories. And I think sometimes we forget that our lives should be ongoing conversion. And everybody has a story. The circumstances might be different, but if we've ever come to that point in our faith life where we have an encounter with Christ that changes our lives, that's a conversion. And that might be a one moment in time thing, or it might be something that evolves as our faith grows. But we're all called to conversion. And so one thing I always like to point out is that I don't share my story, or I try not to bring attention to myself, but to remind myself of what God has done in my life. And when I do that, it helps carry me through those times in life when I don't feel like God is as present, even though he is, but you know how that is. We always go through kind of peaks and valleys in our faith. Absolutely. And so I appreciate the chance to share my story because it reminds me of what God has done despite my unworthiness, the way that he has entered into my life. I grew up in a very small ranching community in Montana, Drummond, Montana. And people are often surprised to hear that I grew up on a ranch because I don't come across as the rancher type. But I did all that stuff. I did the branding and the feeding and the fencing. Wasn't very good at hardly any of it, but I did it. The school I attended, the high school I attended, was very small. There were only about 105 kids at all 4th, 9th through 12th grades, about 105 of us. And in my class, there were about 24 of us. And when I was a sophomore, I started dating a Mormon girl. And I was really impressed with the Mormon young people. In our town, the Mormon Church was the largest church. And it also had the biggest youth group. And those of us who are raised near or in Mormon communities, like here in southern Idaho or Utah, they will be familiar with Mormon churches and their large gymnasiums and their very active youth groups, youth activities. And in my town, you either had to be an athlete or you'll be a partier, like go out and drink beer all weekend long. Well, I wasn't either of those. I tried at sports. I wasn't any good at it. I was more interested in debate than in sports. And we didn't have debate in our high school, obviously. If you've ever watched the show Family Ties with Alex P. Keaton, I don't know if you remember that. Maybe you're too young.
Yeah, no.
I was Alex P. Keaton. You know, the kid that would go to school with a briefcase and I didn't have a briefcase, but almost as bad a nerd as that. So I wasn't an athlete, but I also wasn't a beer drinker or a partier either. The Mormon kids, though, they had volleyball games and dances and stuff going on out at the Mormon Church all the time. And so that's where I started to hang out. My best friend was a Mormon. And then this girl I started dating was a Mormon. And I'll never forget our very first date. It was a double date. And the guy was my best friend. He and his date, who also happened to be Mormon. We went out. I don't remember what we did. Went to a movie or went out to eat or something. And then we he drove into kind of a secluded area and parked the car. And I thought, whoa, what's going to happen here? You know, I didn't think Mormon girls were interested in this sort of thing. And all of a sudden, the guy sitting in front turns around and says, Gene, have you ever heard about Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church? And then they began to tell me the story of Joseph Smith's first vision, where God and Jesus appeared to him, or they say he did. And then they went on to tell me about how the Book of Mormon came about, the angel Moroni appearing and telling Joseph Smith where the golden plates were buried. And I'm just sitting there fascinated by what they are telling me. To me, it sounded almost too fantastical. It almost sounded like something like out of science fiction or something.
Sure.
But what I remember most about that was the sincerity of their conviction. After they told me these fantastic stories, they then each took a turn and they bore their testimony. And you'll hear that a lot in Mormon. You'll say, Mormon missionaries will say to you, I want to bear you my testimony. And that's kind of their personal faith story, their conversion. And they would each say something like this: I know that God lives. I know that Jesus is the Christ. I know that I prayed about it, and I know that God and Jesus appeared to Joseph Smith. And I know the Book of Mormon. I prayed about it, and I know it's the Word of God. And the conviction, the sincerity, I mean, you would almost come to tears telling me about how much they believed this. And I was blown away by that. And so it piqued my curiosity. And so I remember going back to classes over the next few weeks, and I would talk to kids of other faiths. Like there was a girl who was a Methodist, and I remember asking, well, what do you guys believe? And she just said, well, I don't know, go talk to my minister. Well, what are we talking about this? Go away, nerd. So, and then I remember asking another kid, a Catholic kid, or it was a girl, what she believed. And again, same thing. I don't know, go talk to the priest, get away. I don't know what we believe. But the Mormon kids, you would walk up to them. Out of our 24 in our class, 8 of them were Mormon. And if you walk up to them and ask them what they believe, they'll spend all night telling you what they believe. So I was really impressed by their dedication, their zeal, their commitment to their faith. And I thought, maybe there's something to this, the fact that they're so sincere in their conviction. And I kind of envied their certainty. There was little or no mystery in Mormonism. All the questions you have, they have an answer to every question that you have.
And they were all, and I'm assuming they were all in sync too. That's what you're saying.
They were, they were. And in the Catholic faith, we kind of love mystery. Yeah. Like try and explain the Trinity or what heaven is going to be like. To us, that's mystery. And there's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, if we could comprehend everything, then the supernatural, we'd be like God, and we're not.
It dissolves. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was so impressed with their certainty, and so they asked if I would be willing to take a series of what they call discussions or lessons from the Mormon missionaries, and I agreed to do that. One reason I agreed to do it was when we turned 16 in the Mormon Church, Mormon girls or guys couldn't date a non-Mormon, or at least not someone who at least was considering becoming Mormon. So I knew that if I didn't express some interest, then this relationship with this girl that I really liked would be over. Plus she was a cheerleader, so she had all the answers to everything. And so, So I agreed to take the lessons. And again, the lessons are framed in such a way that the only correct answer is by the way they frame the question. They're kind of like loaded questions.
Okay.
As an example, they would say, read this scripture out of Amos chapter 3, verse 7. And that passage says, surely the Lord God will do nothing except that he speak through his servants, the prophets. And so I read that, and then I remember the missionary saying, do you believe that God is doing nothing? Well, no, of course not. So if God is doing nothing, then he's speaking through his servants, the prophets, right? Right. Well, what church on earth claims to have a living prophet? The Mormon Church. Bing, 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 bing. You know, so that's kind of the way that the questions were worded.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm 16 years old. Critical thinking skills when you're 16, even for Alex P. Keaton, really aren't there yet.
Sure.
So then they invited me to church. I started going to their church services. And the first thing I noticed, I didn't have much of a church background. We went to Methodist Bible school. Just mom wanted to get us out of the house in the summer. So she would send us to Bible school for 2 weeks, and we would go to church then. And my grandmother was a practicing Catholic. So when we stayed with my uncle and aunt, who were my age, my grandma and mom kept having kids at the same time, we would go to Mass with them. And so I remember that at the Methodist Church and the Catholic Church, they had a minister or a priest who gave the sermon or the homily every time. Well, in the Mormon Church, families would get up, young people would get up, and they would give the talks. They didn't have an ordained clergy. And that really impressed me. I thought, wow, you know, here are the people, they do their own studying, their own preparation, and they get up and they give the talks. And all of these talks ended with the testimony.
Okay.
I know this church is true. I prayed about it. The first Sunday of every month was called Fast and Testimony Meeting, where you fasted for 2 meals, and then you got up and you bore your testimony in church. And so you would hear this repeated over and over again. We are the only true and living church upon the face of the earth. We are led by a prophet of God. I know that at that time his name was Spencer W. Kimball, as a prophet of God. And so it's almost kind of a subtle form of brainwashing, even though they would be angry with that terminology.
Sure.
But you hear that over and over again, and you really start to think, you know, this must be true. How could people with such sincere conviction be wrong?
So there's a single prophet at a time, and there's like
Yes.
a succession of prophets?
Yes.
Okay.
And a succession of apostles. The Mormon Church is led by a man they consider to be a prophet, and then he has 12 apostles. And they believe that those 12 apostles have the same authority, the same keys, the same avenue to revelation as the apostles did in the New Testament.
Got it.
So they believe in continuing revelation, and God continues to speak through his prophets and apostles. And so you would hear that repeated over and over again. And so I took these 6 lessons and went to church quite a few times. I started going almost every Sunday. Got out of work that way because church lasted 3 hours. But I really was impressed with the people, and they kind of became my family. I did not have a good home life. I mean, my parents were good people, but they weren't loving people. They weren't people who took an interest in my life, whereas the Mormons did. I expressed an interest in journalism and writing, and I remember the ward members there said, well, have you thought about applying for this scholarship and doing it? And they began to encourage me in the things that I was interested in. And I wasn't getting that at home at all. And I think that is an appeal for a lot of people who join religions like the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses. There's this sense of family and community that is missing. So you know, even when I went on my Mormon mission, a lot of the people that we baptized were people who were lonely, who maybe had gone through a recent divorce or maybe a death in the family. And so they had questions about mortality and life, and they were hurting. And those are the kind of people that were open to the message of Mormonism. And so they became my family. I started running around with them. All my friends after a while were the Mormon kids. And so at my very last day of school, my junior year, I'm baptized into the Mormon Church. My parents they weren't religious people, so they didn't care a lot, although they kind of were hoping I would wait till I was 18. But I said, no, I want to do this now. And so I got baptized my last day of my junior year. Started going to early morning seminary. Senior year, I changed all my plans. I had planned on going to the University of Montana and majoring in journalism, but instead I dropped that, enrolled to go to BYU, Idaho, which at that time was known as Rick's College in Rexburg. Went to school there. Really got immersed in Mormonism there because all the students are LDS. At that time, there was about 5,500 students. Now it's 3 times that. Got really involved in the church there, got involved in the campus newspaper. By my sophomore year, I was editor of the campus newspaper. And so just loving life as a Mormon. And during my sophomore year, I'm reading a funeral discourse, a funeral homily given by Joseph Smith, who was the founder of Mormonism. And he was preaching at a funeral of a guy by the name of King Follett. And he was a very prominent person in Nauvoo, Illinois, where the Mormons had their headquarters right before they came to Utah. And he had passed away, and this sermon has become very popular in Mormonism. It's called the King Follett Discourse.
Okay.
And in this discourse, I hear for the first time the Mormon belief that God was once a man and that man has the potential to become a God, even a God of his own world. And I had never heard that before. It blew me away. And I remember my roommate, a lifelong Mormon from Arco, Idaho, not too far from Rexburg, where we were going to school. I said, listen to this. And I read him this King Follett discourse. And he said, sure, that's the doctrine of eternal progression. It's probably the cornerstone of our faith. And I remember being puzzled by that, thinking, well, if it's the cornerstone, how come I didn't know about it? He said, well, it's too much for a convert to take. You need to have the milk before the meat, as the Apostle Paul said.
Sure.
And if we told people that while they were investigating, they probably wouldn't join the church. Good point. They probably wouldn't, because it just blew me away.
And
the idea that I could become a God.
So you said eternal progression, is that
Yeah,
right?
that's what they call it, the doctrine of eternal progression.
Okay, yeah. Got it.
Modern day Mormons, they don't like to talk about that very much. They kind of, I remember Larry King interviewed Gordon B. Hinckley, the Mormon president, this has probably been 20 years ago, about that teaching. I remember him asking him, well, do you believe that you can become a God? And if Hinckley had been courageous enough to say what true Mormon teaching is, he would have said, yes, because that's what our prophets have taught us. Instead, he just kind of hemmed and hawed and said, well, these things are a mystery. We really don't know. He was trying to water it down. And a lot of modern day Mormons, if you walked up to a Mormon friend right now and said, do you believe that you're going to become a God? Unless he's really orthodox, and really dogmatic, he'll probably hem and haw and say, well, we don't know. But that is the teaching. And they've not ever changed it. They don't emphasize it that much anymore, but that is the teaching. And that God was once a man, and because of his good works in another world, he progressed to his current state.
Got it. Okay.
And we're on that same journey. And so that's why they call it eternal progression. So what I did with that, even though it troubled me, is I just kind of put it in the back of my mind and thought, well, I'm not going to, everything else about the church I love. Book of Mormon, modern revelation, living prophets, all that stuff I believe. Eternal progression, not so much, but that's my fault. I need to study more. Over time, I'll come to accept it.
Yeah.
And looking back on it, I never did accept that. That was the stumbling block for me. That was the one teaching that I could never accept that eventually leads me out of Mormonism. But at the time, I thought, well, I can live with this if I try.
Sure. And is that common, you think, among those that have left, that there is this singular, maybe not singular, but that's like the core reason?
Among those who have left to become Christian, yes.
Yeah.
Which is a tiny minority. Among those who have left because they're upset at religion and they see all the inconsistencies in Mormonism, no, because they didn't leave for theological reasons like I did.
Yeah.
With the advent of the internet, so many, especially young Mormons, are researching their history, and they see the inconsistencies, the revelations that didn't come to pass, the way that the prophets have changed the teaching, the Book of Mormon inconsistencies. And so they're resigning for those reasons. And unfortunately, they feel they've been lied to and deceived, so they have a bad attitude about religion in general. My own daughter and son-in-law, very active Mormons. Well, he was active Mormon. She joined for him. They're just nothing, because they just think that all religion is the same. You're lied to. And I think that's the attitude of a lot of former Mormons. My situation was a little different in that it was a spiritual experience that I'm jumping ahead. So
no, that's good. That's good.
Anyway, so after Rick's college, I graduated. It was, at that time, it was just a 2-year junior college. And I began to save up to go on a Mormon mission. The prophet of the church at the time, Spencer Kimball, was trying to double the missionary force. They only had about 16,000 missionaries. He wanted 32,000. And so there was a lot of pressure, especially on young men. Young women could go, but the pressure was on young men to go on missions. And because my family were not Mormon, it was up to me to save up a lot of money to try and go on the mission. And so I worked at a newspaper in Rigby, Idaho for 1 year, saved up my money, got my mission call to Australia. And that's where I served my mission. Before the mission starts, you go to the Missionary Training Center in Salt Lake City. And I'll never forget our mission president saying that when you go on your mission, you can talk about everything except eternal progression, the temple, and blacks and the priesthood.
Okay.
This was in the late 1970s, and at that time, blacks were still not admitted into the Mormon temples or into the Mormon priesthood.
Okay.
And so if people brought up eternal progression, temples, or blacks in the priesthood, we were just to bear our testimony and leave. And so that again made me think, no wonder I didn't hear about eternal progression when I was studying, because you're instructed not to talk about that.
Yeah.
Still, that was what my roommate called the cornerstone of Mormon theology. It would be like, becoming Catholic and not telling anyone about the Trinity, because it's so basic to our faith, because you can't understand the Trinity. It's true, you can't, but we don't not tell people about it.
Sure.
So I go on my mission. The first year of my mission goes fantastic as far as a Mormon's perspective would be. Normally, whenever you see the missionaries, they're always in pairs, and there's one that's older and has been out longer, and then there's his junior companion, is the younger guy. And so you're usually a junior companion for 3 or 4 months before you become a senior companion, and then you can maybe move up in the ranks. Well, after I was out 5 weeks, was named a senior companion and a trainer of new missionaries. And that just shows you how gung-ho I was. I mean, I took it very seriously. So I became a trainer of new missionaries, and I became a district leader, which meant that I was over about 6 or 8 other missionaries in our little geographic district. And then by the time I was out a year, I was the zone leader, which meant I had about 32 missionaries. Instead of a bike, I had a car, driving around to training these other missionaries, driving on the other side of the road in Australia, and baptizing a lot of people.
If I may, how do you gauge success? If you're climbing the ranks, how?
Numbers,
quota.
Books of Mormon placed, lessons taught, and baptisms.
Okay.
I mean, it was a sales. It was very. I mean, they might not like the fact that I use that term, but it was definitely like a sales organization. We reported to our leaders, to the mission home, every month or every week, how many Books of Mormon we placed, how many lessons we taught, and how many convert baptisms we got. And the particular area of Sydney where I was very heavily Anglican, Church of England, or Episcopalian in our country, or Catholic. Probably 80% of the people were Anglican or Catholic. And most all of them were not very committed to their faith. So the converts we were getting were primarily Anglicans and Catholics. When I was out about a year after my stint as a zone leader ended, they called me as a public relations missionary to go to Canberra, which is the national capital, and work there. We gave presentations to businesses and governments about Mormon family home evening, and tried to use the family home evening as a way to show how people can keep their families together and spend time with their children. I remember one of the lessons I taught was to the Minister of Education for the government of Australia, which would be comparable to our Secretary of Education here.
Okay.
Taught him in his Parliament House office in Canberra, and it was quite the experience. So I say all that to just show you how gung-ho I was and how convinced I was. It was the second year of my mission when things began to change a little bit. And you know how we go through life, and oftentimes we don't know how God is working in our life until we can look back and see. So a lot of these things that are happening, I'm not putting it all together until later. Now looking back on it, I can see how God started to work in my life. And I can't explain why these things started to happen other than the fact that I had been baptized. My parents, when I was a baby, baptized me into the Lutheran Church. So I had received a Trinitarian baptism. And as you know, as Catholics, we believe that a grace accompanies that, a miraculous grace. And bless you, you're in the family of God forever. No matter how far you stray, if you're baptized Catholic, you're baptized Christian, you always are. That little tiny flame is there. You might have it doused a lot, but it's there. And I think that's why some of these things started to happen. One of the things that started to happen was an aunt of mine had become a born-again Christian. And she started writing me. And her letters were not preachy. They weren't, Mormonism is wrong and you need to repent and become a Christian. They were basically just what God was doing in her life and how much God meant to her and how he was answering her prayers and how, raising her 2 sons, the things she was struggling with, just her life story. And she would also send me books by Christian apologists. And we weren't supposed to read anything that was not mission-approved literature. But being the radical I was, late at night, I would read some of the stuff that my aunt was sending me. So that was one seed being planted. Another thing that was happening was my companion and I were assigned to a very upper class area of Sydney called St. Ives. And there was a very large Anglican church there that was kind of evangelical Anglican. They called it low church.
Okay.
And so there was this dynamic preacher there. And we would knock on the doors of these people, and lo and behold, instead of kicking us out or hiding behind their couch or dousing us with their sprinkler, they would invite us in. And before we would get too far into our memorized lessons, all our lessons were memorized, all the questions were memorized back then, they would begin to ask us questions, particularly, what do you believe about Jesus? Who is Jesus to you? The most important question, in my opinion, in all the Bible, is when Jesus says to the apostles, who do men say that I am? And that's a question that every one of us has to answer at some point in our life. And that's what these Christians were asking us, is who do you say that Jesus is? Because they knew Mormonism.
Sure.
They knew we didn't believe Jesus was God, and they knew that we didn't believe that God was the only God. And so they would ask us that, and then they would share their faith in Jesus. And I remember being so impressed by that, because now I was hearing testimony from people of a different religious tradition that was just as sincere, just as closely held as the Mormon testimony was. And I began to think, well, maybe you shouldn't base your faith on the sincerity of the people. I mean, if your faith depends on people, you're going to be disappointed, because there are going to be people who are going, as we know, popes and bishops, and who would make Joseph Smith look as white as snow. So I began to see that that there are other believers of other faiths who have just as deep a conviction. And I know that sounds kind of basic, but I was really naive about stuff like that. And another thing they did was they would pray with us. Normally we would lead the prayers because people didn't know how to pray. But these evangelicals, they knew how to pray. And powerful prayers. I could tell that these people didn't know about Jesus, but they knew Jesus. I felt like I knew about Jesus, but I didn't really know Jesus. My relationship was to my religion. Their relationship was to Christ. Big difference. And they also had these scriptures from Isaiah that just gave me fits. Chapter 42, 43, and 44 that talk about Jesus, or about God being the only God, and that there's no other God created before him, neither shall there be after him. And there's one, Isaiah 44, where I won't be sure and quote it right. Is there any God beside me? Yea, I know not any. And then these Christians would say, do you believe God is all-knowing? We would say, well, of course. Well, if there are more gods than him, why doesn't he know about them? Why does he say, yea, I know not any? And so I remember defending Mormonism to their face when they would share these scriptures. But going home at night and these scriptures just giving me fits. And so what these Christians were doing, what my aunt was doing, is they were just planting seeds. And that's all that God asks us to do. I think sometimes we put a lot of pressure on ourselves. We think that we have to be out there converting the world.
Yeah.
And all God wants us to do is plant the seeds. Someone else, like Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gives the growth. So plant the seeds, and then let someone else come and water it, and then let God make it sprout. Don't think that you're doing the converting. And that's what these Christians were doing. They were planting seeds. They were causing doubt in my mind about Mormonism. So just as fast as I went up in the ranks of my missionary experience my first year, the second year, I started getting bumped down because I started asking a lot of questions of what these evangelicals were sharing with us. And so I went from public relations missionary down to zone leader, down to district leader, because I was starting to ask these questions. Then one final thing happened on my mission. Right before I went home, Billy Graham, Christian evangelist, came out to Sydney for a crusade. He hadn't been out since 1957, and so this was 25 years later about. And the excitement that his visit caused amongst the people, and I will never forget the newspapers, which we weren't supposed to read, but I did, printed Billy Graham's sermons verbatim. So you could, he had his crusade, and the next day you'd open up the paper and there was his sermon. And I remember reading those sermons and hearing just the basics of Christianity taught. And so that had quite the impact as well. So my mission ends, and I go back, I enrolled to go to BYU, Utah in Provo. But with a lot of questions, thinking, okay, I'm going to really do some heavy research here in Mormon history and theology. I get to BYU and get immersed in that culture again and just kind of forget the doubts and the questions. As a matter of fact, I had convinced myself that the reason I had those doubts and questions is because I was being disobedient. I was reading the literature I wasn't supposed to read. I was listening to these Christians. I also would visit on our day off, I would visit Catholic and Anglican cathedrals because I just loved the sense of reverence. And, if you've ever been in a Mormon church, it's a meeting hall. They call it a meeting hall because there's basically no art or anything in there. Yeah. And you go in these Gothic cathedrals in these big cities and stained glass windows and the statuary, all of that stuff. I just felt like it was a little taste of heaven on earth. And my mission companions would, why do you want to go there? And I would just say, well, I'm interested in architecture. Well, I could have cared less about architecture. But I just love the feeling that I got when I went into those churches. And of course, I didn't know anything about the tabernacle or the presence of Christ in Catholic churches, but I'm sure that was a draw as well. And that's why I felt that sense of peace when I would go inside them. So
let me ask you one thing here.
Yeah.
Why do you think ultimately they did not, or certain groups do not want you to read certain books, certain newsletters? Was it fear for someone to be exposed to other things, or is it just that's a waste of time because we have the truth? I mean, I'm so fascinated to know about what drives that, because I think when you have the truth, there's a sense of security that comes with it that would allow you to say, go search everything
Absolutely.
You can get your hands on.
Yeah. It's a bit of both, but it's more the first, fear that you're going to find out something that will cause you to doubt and leave the church.
Got it.
And that's why the internet has gotten to be such a problem for the Latter-day Saints and for some other, what I would call cults or offbeat religions, is that people can now, in the privacy of their own home, research history and theology and discover for their own selves things that they don't want you to find out about. So yeah, that was the main reason. They just felt like not only was it a waste of time, but you could be led astray.
Sure.
Read all of this stuff.
Okay.
And so when I got to BYU, I got immersed again in campus life, and I thought, okay, I had the doubts because I was disobedient. Began to go to the temple more often. I became the gospel doctrine teacher in our student ward, and then before long, I was elders quorum president over about 200 other men in our elders quorum. So again, you can kind of see that, getting back in full bore into it all again. But in the back of my mind were still these doubts about eternal progression. So I would go to the BYU library, and they had on the fourth floor in an enclosed room, they had books that were about Mormon history and theology written by non-Mormons or anti-Mormons. And they had them there, but you couldn't check them out. And the only way that you could look at them is you would go in there, you'd give them your student card, they would take your student card, which, as you remember from being a university student, you can't do anything without that card.
Sure.
And so because I knew that if I went there a whole lot of times, that would raise some red flags by my priesthood leaders, I knew that I could only go 2 or 3 times. So on a few Saturdays, I got up the minute the library opened at like 7 or 6, really early in the morning, and I spent all day in the library reading Mormon history and theology from the perspective of other people than just faithful Mormons. Again, no internet. You know, the internet would have all that, but we didn't have that back then. So again, these doubts started to come back. Another thing that happened was an uncle of mine, he was actually the younger brother of the aunt that was writing me the letters.
Okay.
He also had become a born-again Christian, largely through this aunt's influence. And he invites me up to his wedding, which was in Missoula, Montana, about a 10-hour drive from Provo. And it was on President's Day weekend, so I did have the ability to drive up there and still get back for classes by Tuesday. And so I go up to this wedding, and remember that the issue that I'm still struggling with is eternal progression. And the wedding was in a Foursquare gospel church. And I'll never forget walking into the church. There was an empty cross at the front of the church, and I had always felt a drawing to the cross. In the Mormon Church, there are no crosses. The men or the women don't wear like a cross necklace or anything like that. Okay. We always taught people that the cross was a weapon that killed Christ. Why would you have that on your church? But I felt a drawing to the cross, and I actually loved seeing the cross, even when I was a Mormon. And so there was that pull. But over the top of the cross, there was a scripture inscribed on the wall from Hebrews 13:8. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so I'm just blown away by this passage, which I'd probably read before, but had never really seen. You know how that goes. You read something, but you don't really see it.
Yeah.
And it affected me so much that I remember my knees kind of buckled because I was standing when I read it as I came into the church, and I had to sit down because I just, I was kind of overcome by emotion when I read that. And
saying that right now made me kind of tear up.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember leaving that wedding and that long drive back to Provo, and finally coming to the conclusion that the Jesus that the Mormons follow is different than the Jesus that the Christians worship. And I need to decide which Jesus am I going to follow.